let me tell you, I was introduced incorrectly. My name is Odala. Or that's what it was before the English took it and anglicized it and made it into this. And then my family, for some reason or another, when we came over to America, decided to add an E. And I was told through the family grapevine that they thought that made it sound more or look more American. I don't know if it did that. It had the effect of having everybody ask me if I'm related to Mayor Daley of Chicago. I am not. Daley, when you do genealogy, it's like Smith. There are thousands of us. Anyway, a little bit about myself. I guess I should give you my qualifications for speaking on the Irish. I am 5th generation Irish. My great-great-great-grandfather, Michael Daly, came from Bantry Bay, County Cork, landed in St. John's, New Brunswick, and walked to Bangor, Maine. It was from there that he set up his own lumber business and became quite successful. And another interesting thing about my family, we are a family of boxers, I guess the Fighting Irish you could call it. Here are his 2 sons, Michael Daly, who was the middleweight champion of New England in the early 1900s, late 1800s, and his brother Danny Daly, who had the record for the number of rounds ever fought in the history of boxing, 91 rounds. Now that's before they had the Marcus de Queensberry rules where a round was 3 minutes. A round back then was when you got knocked down. So that was fought in Omaha. Now my mother's side of the family are the O'Mahaneys. And they ended up in Charlestown, Massachusetts. And it's said that my grandfather was born in the shadow of the Bunker Hill Monument. So I guess maybe I'm a little qualified to speak on the Irish in America. This is really a lecture entitled, No Irish Need Apply. And it's not really on the phrase, no Irish need apply. We've all heard this. This is just a tag to kind of get you interested here. This is a history of the Irish in Boston, as we'll see here. Now, let's get into our lecture. Way back when, the Irish, believe it or not, were not the first people to come to Boston. It was the Puritans. And the Puritans came, as we all know, seeking religious freedom. And they came to Boston and they wanted to create what they called the city on the hill, a shining example of their version of Christianity. And just to give you a little background, the Puritans were a product of the Protestant Reformation. The Puritans believed that the Church of England was still too Catholic. If you walked into an Anglican church today, you'd think you were in a Catholic church. They wanted to purify the Anglican Church of anything that smacked of Romanism or Catholicism, and that's why they were called Puritans. Now, when they began to agitate for these things in England, the Anglican Church persecuted them, and this is why they eventually came to America, seeking religious freedom for their views. However, they didn't want to grant it to other people. They believed in their own religious freedom, but when other folks came over with other beliefs, they were very, very intolerant. And this is where their city on the hill was, Boston. This is what it looked like when they first landed in 1630. Just nothing more than a peninsula. Sometimes at high tide, it would be an island. And as I said, they wanted to build their city on the hill. This is what it probably looked like. There's Beacon Hill with the original beacon. Now, let's get to the Irish. The first Irish were brought here against their will. They were brought as what we call indentured servants. Now, normally, when you went to school, you learned that an indentured servant was somebody who agreed to come over. They agreed to come over for a period of 7 or so years, and that would be in return for passage to America, and at the end of that time, they could go free, and they might even get some training. Well, it was a little bit different with the original Irish here, and it was mainly due to this fella. This is somebody many of you may have heard of. How many have heard of Oliver Cromwell? Yes. During the period of Cromwell, when the Puritans actually, if you're familiar with English history, they went to war with the Anglicans, and the Puritans came on top. Cromwell continued the policy of England of invading Ireland to colonize it. It had been going on all the way back to probably the Norman invasion, if you want to get down to it. But he ramped it up even more. And for this reason, because he had heard stories coming back from Ireland that English people had been mistreated by these Irish, so he decided to take his new model army, as they called it, and go over and get retribution. And they did that with a vengeance. They went to war with the Irish. At Drogheda, after winning the battle, they went on to kill 4,000 Irish civilians. Later on, at Wexford, 1,500 civilians were killed. And I'm not talking about combatants. This is innocent civilians that were just randomly killed. And this was in retribution for what he saw as brutalities that had been done towards the English, which actually were very exaggerated. And then here, at the siege of Waterford, 400 civilians were killed. After this was all done and the Irish were on their knees, this took place here. In the 1650s, it started with 100,000 Irish children were plucked from their parents and sent over to the colonies. Not only Massachusetts Bay, but also Virginia and the colonies down in the Caribbean. Also, thousands of men and women were abducted and sold as indentured servants to come here to America. This is how the Irish were first brought over. And this is how they were treated. Not really much better than slaves, if you want to put it that way. They came over, there were many that were brought over to the colonies, Virginia, and up here in New England as well. And here's a little runaway slave ad, believe it or not. We've seen these for years in school, having to do with slaves running away, and as you know, they would put ads out advertising to get their slave back. But if you look very closely here, the top ad is for a Negro fellow, and right below it is one for an Irishman. And many times the Irish and the blacks would actually run away together. That's probably the first thing the Irish did once they were brought and got off the ship. They'd run away. And they were treated very harshly when they were captured here. This is how they'd be treated. Put in the stocks or the pillory. And even to the point of whipping. So this is how the Irish first came over to Boston. And the sad thing is we don't have many names. They were just these nameless people that were brought over. There's not much recorded other than people actually buying the indentured servitudes of these folks. And this is how they first came over here. Now, the first real wave of immigration was what we call the Scots-Irish. Now, the Scots-Irish were Presbyterians. They were really transplants from Scotland into Northern Ireland. And the Presbyterians and the Puritans, their theology was very, very similar. They were both what we call Calvinists. and they believed in a church that should be devoid of anything Roman Catholic, and it should be simple. They were imitating what they thought was the first century Christians, devoid of any statues, robes, or anything like that. So they were convinced to come over by the Puritans. In fact, another thing brought them over too was that the Anglicans had taken over from the Puritans in England, and they passed the Sacramental Act, which basically outlawed all Presbyterian ministers. So they decided to come over here where the Puritans had already set up shop here at the behest of Cotton Mather, who was very famous for the Salem witch trials, as you know. Now, the first one brought over was a Reverend Holmes, and he came over. He brought several ships of people over. He himself ended up as the minister over in Martha's Vineyard. Now, when they got here, they found they thought they would be welcomed with open arms by the Puritans, because really there wasn't much difference in their religion, other than that they were Scots, Irish, and Presbyterians. Not really much difference. But what they found was the Puritans had somewhat of an attitude of, yeah, we like you, but not really. When they got here, they found out that they thought they were going to be staying in Boston. Some of them did. Many of them got shipped out to the frontier lands, Springfield and Northampton, place like that. Some did stay in Boston, and they set up the first church of Presbyterianism. And the Puritans, and you get the idea right here how the Puritans felt about them. They called it the Church of the Presbyterian Strangers. So although they were kinship, there was kinship as far as religion, they were still Irish and Scots, which didn't really sit too well with the Puritans. By the way, the site of this church in downtown Boston, I believe it's on Federal Street, is now this building here. And I couldn't fit the whole thing into a picture, so I did this for you. That's where that church was. The church, the Congregational Church, the first church on Arlington Street, is where that congregation eventually moved. Or I should say Presbyterian Church, sorry. Now, this is the Famine Memorial in Boston, not too far from that building I just showed you. And most people believe that the Irish struggle began with the potato famine here. And we have a beautiful statue. It really began long before that, really. The first inklings of anti-Irish Catholic sentiment were some laws that were passed in Boston. This is the Anti-Catholic Law of 1647. Passed about the same time Governor Winthrop's, who is the man in the statue here. Here's Winthrop's. That was in Scully Square, by the way. It's been moved to, I think, the Boston Public Library. And this is the main gist of the law. To quote it, "Death to every Jesuit, seminary, priest, missionary, or other spiritual ecclesiastical person made or ordained by the authority, power, jurisdiction, derived, challenged, or pretended from the Pope or the See of Rome." Basically what that's saying is Catholic priests are outlawed, so therefore you can't practice Catholicism. And again, that was a shot not only against the Irish, but any French people that were coming in too. So any kind of Catholic meetings that were held, they were held underground. They couldn't really worship openly, and because of this. And then we have a first instance here of somebody who died at the hands of the Puritans. Her name was Goodwife Glover. She was a Gaelic woman who was brought over as an indentured servant, and she was accused of witchcraft. Now, she was accused of witchcraft because they found that she had been saying the Lord's Prayer in Gaelic. She was brought in, asked again to recite the Lord's Prayer, and then she tried to recite it in the only other way she knew, which was in Latin. That was a mistake. So because of the existing laws, she was accused of being a witch, a good ploy to get rid of somebody. And the underlying subtext here is really that she was Catholic, couldn't really speak English. She was also saying a rosary, which they saw as idolatry. So she was accused of being a witch. She was taken to Boston Common, and she was hanged, one of the first witches to be hanged in Boston. Now, if you go to Boston today, there is a marker in the North End which commemorates Goody Glover, and it's on a restaurant that is named after her if you'd like to go to see Goody Glover's. This is the sign right outside. And then there was something called the gunpowder plot. Many of you may know that this occurred over in England. We're back in England again. And what happened here was this gentleman, whose name was Guy Fawkes, decided that it would be a great idea, along with some of his Confederates, to take barrels of gunpowder, put them under Parliament, and light them on fire. Now, why did he want to do this? He was a Catholic, and he was against the government of England. And the only thing was that he got caught before the plot happened. Now, in England today, they celebrate this day. It's almost like the 4th of July in America. It's Guy Fawkes Day. And I believe it's November 5th, they celebrate Guy Fawkes Day in England. Now, it translated to something wholly different over here in Boston. In Boston, they didn't call it Guy Fawkes Day, they called it Pope's Day. And what they would do in Boston was that they would take an effigy of the Pope, and different groups would have their own effigy of the Pope, and they'd take their effigies around town and try to light each other's effigies on fire. And the one that was lasting at the end won the whole contest. Now, this went on until about the Revolutionary War. And the man that put an end to this practice was a man named George Washington, General George Washington at the time. And when he saw this practice being done in Boston, after they had taken it back from the British, he put an end to it, saying, there are many Irishmen in my army that fight for this country, and I won't have this. And that was put an end to this. Now, I found online, there are still commemorative mugs that you can get here. They're in a museum, of course. These commemorate Pope's Day in Boston. So that bigotry or prejudice of the Puritans has been deep-seated. It's been there a long time, and this is, even in the early days of Boston, was there. And then the Irish begin to come into Boston. They begin to emerge. They start to take a stance a little bit here. They come out of the shadows and they have their first Mass. And it wasn't held till 1788. And if you go to Boston, the site where that famine memorial is, down by the Borders bookstore, that's where the first church was. In fact, this was the first Catholic Mass held in New England, 1788. That's how long it took them to be able to come out in the open and have a Mass. Now, all these laws, the anti-Catholic law and everything, had kind of fallen by the wayside by this time. There were many Irish trickling into the city, many French, and this is where they worshipped. Now, also, the first cathedral to be built in Boston wasn't built until 1803, and this was the Cathedral of the Holy Cross, which is no longer. There is a plaque commemorating the location down on in Boston here. The Archdiocese still owns this building that is in the place of where the cathedral was. And the first Irish Catholic burial ground is St. Augustine's Burial Ground, and that is in South Boston. And I believe that was not put into the early 1800s as well. And these graves here are some of the first consecrated burials in Boston. Before this, the folks that were Irish Catholic had to be buried wherever. In fact, somebody just recently told me that they were doing some road work in Boston and they came across an old burial ground. And they dug up some old bodies, and they found out from the clothing and the artifacts with the bodies that it was an old Irish burial ground, but it was not consecrated ground. Now, this was the first consecrated ground, and it's in South Boston, as I said, and when I went there to photograph it, I was a little bit disappointed because it's in really bad repair. As you could see, that sign is not looking too good. When I took these pictures, the gate was locked, of course. I couldn't get in. But if you look at these pictures, the area is unkempt. It's not mown. There's trash barrels. It's kind of a sad situation. This is still owned by the Archdiocese of Boston. So I don't know if anybody knows Sean O'Malley. Give him a call. As you see there, that maybe it was just the day I came, I don't know. No, yeah, it looks like it hasn't been taken care of for a while. And this is really the first Irish burial ground in Boston. First official burial ground. And of course, they begin to get their own paper together. This is a means of communication, which is very important. The Irish start communicating with each other. And in these early days, there were still very few Irish. It was a big minority. Not too many yet. Then it begins as a trickle. Not in the 1840s with the potato famine, but it really begins in the 1820s. And it's because of this, the penal laws. And if you look at these, in a nutshell, if you were Irish, if you were Catholic in Ireland controlled by England, you didn't have the right to be a human being. Look at this. You're forbidden to exercise your religion, forbidden to receive an education, forbidden to enter a profession, hold public office, engage in trade, corporate or town, purchase land, vote, keep any arms, be a guardian to a child. It goes on. And what they were trying to do is break the back of the Irish Catholics so they could force them out and move in and colonize Ireland. Many people did leave. And this is where you start to see a small migration of Irish Catholics in the 1820s. And also the Enclosure Acts, which basically said you couldn't use if you had land, you couldn't use it for anything. The land had been taken away from the Irish Catholics years before. Basically, people whose family had owned land for generations were living on that land as now tenant farmers to an English landlord. Now, this gives you an idea of how the population was beginning to grow here. The Irish population was 2,000 by 1820. By 1825, it had grown to 5,000. And by 1830, it was 7,000. Now, to give you a bit of perspective, the total population in Boston was 61,000. So you're looking at a very small minority still, but it was beginning to emerge and show itself. Now, even with this small minority, we begin to see problems between the Puritans and these new Irish. And here are some of the early conflicts. There were many more than this, but these are some of the early ones that really stand out in the history of Boston. This is the Ursuline convent that was in Charlestown, what is now, it's actually Somerville because that was incorporated from part of Charlestown. The nuns were basically Irish, Catholic, some French, and it was a school. And many of the Puritan, or as now they were being called, the old Yankees, were sending their children to this convent. They thought nothing of that because they knew that their children were going to get a first-class education from these nuns that were trained in the classics. We're talking Latin, Greek, learning how to play the piano, the harp. This was classical education for ladies during this period. Now, a woman named Rebecca Reed had become a novice at the convent. She was actually from Puritan stock, was one of the students, became a novice, and then decided to leave the convent and wrote a book about it. And in her book, she claimed that the nuns were trying to brainwash all these young girls, that they were actually holding them prisoner against their will, and all these really exaggerated claims. And it came out later that none of this was true. She probably wrote this book because she knew it would sell. And many people in Boston, even the ones that couldn't read, had heard these rumors of these people being captured and held against their will. And then shortly after that, one of the nuns actually, she was a music teacher. I guess what happened, she had a bit of a nervous breakdown. And as a teacher, I can understand that. And she left the convent and ended up in the house of one of the leading families in Boston. Now, she refused to go back, and the rumor started spreading that she had escaped the convent. She had escaped the bonds of the convent, when in fact she just had kind of had a breakdown and had to get away. Now, what happened was the Mother Superior, whose name was Mary Moffat, her religious name was Sister St. George, and Bishop Fenwick at the time went over to talk to this young nun, and eventually they convinced her to come back. Well, the rumors were flying around town that they had brought her back and she was probably chained in the basement, and there were probably other people that were in prison there as well. To exasperate this, a visiting minister named Reverend Lyman Beecher, I think he was the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe, made 3 sermons, anti-Catholic, anti-Irish, anti-immigrant sermons. And even in one sermon, he encouraged the burning of Catholic churches. Well, somehow this got out, and before you knew it, there was a mob outside the convent, 3,000 people, and they demanded entry to the convent to see if there were any people being held against their will. Now, what this mob didn't know, that the town selectmen had already been alerted to this supposed travesty, and they had already approached the Mother Superior and gained entry and looked around, and nothing was askew. Everybody was happy. There was nobody being inculcated into the Catholic religion. All these things were nothing but rumor. But nobody decided to tell the crowd that. The selectmen knew it, and the crowd was wild. It was mainly made up of workers, and they went wild that night. They went in. The first thing they did was they kicked the door down. They flooded into the convent. Now, the nuns and Mother Superior, they knew this was happening. They heard the banging at the door, and they went out the back door and hid in the garden. Meanwhile, the mob went crazy. They went through the convent, looting it, throwing beds and clothes and linens out the windows. There were several pianos that were thrown out the windows. And then somebody decided to light it on fire, and they burned that convent to the ground. Now, the next day when the news came out about this, even the people in Boston were aghast at this. They couldn't believe that this kind of violence would happen in their town. Well, it did. And the mob was still active. They were even behind the scenes plotting to go to the cathedral and burn that. When they got there, though, they found that the governor had actually called out the militia, and they couldn't get anywhere near the cathedral. So what they decided to do 3 days later, after burning the convent, they went back and looted it some more and broke into some of the graves of some of the nuns that were there in the tombs. And there's one story, it's kind of apocryphal, we don't really have much documentation on it, that they actually stole the gold out of one of the nuns' mouths. And this is in the 1800s. So that hatred, that animosity between the two people, the Irish and the Yankees, is really building up by this point. And then just a year later, there's another incident that happens. Now, this is a memorial to that convent burning. And I went up there when I was doing research for this, and it's still called Mount Benedict. This is what it looks like. This is where that convent was. It's just a neighborhood now. And I do this oftentimes. I walk through places and I think, do the people that live here know what happened back in 1820? I doubt it. And you can almost still feel the ghosts. Now, another incident happened just a year later, and that was the Broad Street riot. This is Broad Street today. Broad Street was one of the first places that the Irish moved into. And there aren't really too many buildings left from the period of the 1830s here that we're talking about. I think this is probably the only example left, but it was basically tenements. And what happened here is that the story goes that there was an Irish funeral procession coming down the street. And there was also a Yankee fire company coming back from a fire. The two groups were crossing paths. Now, somebody said something to someone, we don't know what the words were, but a big fight erupted. And before you knew it, there were up to 3,000 people in the street. There was the biggest melee you ever saw here. Here's a painting done by a friend of mine, Gerard McCarthy, to give you a little bit of an idea here. People were going in and out of the buildings, looting buildings, burning buildings, and it went on for about a day or so, and then finally it was quelled. But this tension is building, it's building here with the Broad Street riot. And then we come to the deluge, the Great Potato Famine. In Ireland, most of the people, as I said, had been relegated to tenant farming. And the only subsistence that they had was the potato. Meanwhile, on the land all over Ireland, they're growing wheat, they're growing barley, they're growing all sorts of things. But if you were a tenant farmer, you had a little square in your backyard, and that's what you used to plant your own food. And the potato was that food. Now, in 1845, there was a fungus that hit the potatoes and wiped out the potato crop. It came back in successive years for 2-3 more years. A big famine ensued because those people, that was their food source. Meanwhile, England is still growing all these crops and exporting them out of Ireland. And the potato famine took hold. Also, the poor laws were put into effect. Essentially, the government, which was a pretty laissez-faire government, they believed a hands-off approach was what was best. Let the landlords take care of their own people. And instead of helping the people, the landlords evicted them and just kicked them out in the street. And here you have some pictures of that happening. This is from an actual newspaper of the time, an eviction. So they're not only starving, but they're homeless. Many flocked to the cities. There were soup kitchens set up when it got really, really bad. And many people just starved to death. There were stories of people found on the side of the road. And the description was that their mouths were green. And the reason being was they were trying to subsist on grass. And it was all over their mouth. And these are just pictures. And these were in the newspapers that were being sold in England of this great famine. And there was no end in sight. But the answer seemed to be because passage to America was a lot cheaper than it had been, to put people on ships and send them out before they starved. And this is what was done. Many people boarded these ships First they'd go from England to Liverpool, and then they would be put on one of these ships and sent to America. And here they are saying goodbye. Now these ships were called coffin ships. This really gives you a good idea why. To begin with, the people who had been malnourished, they were already sick because of the malnourishment, were crowded onto these ships and shipped to America. If you look at this picture here, I'm amazed because as a history teacher, I used to teach the Middle Passage when they brought the slaves over from Africa. And this is so reminds me of how they would do the loose pack or the tight pack. And people are just packed onto these ships. And because of that, you had a high mortality rate. Many of the people never made it to America. They were thrown overboard. And when they got here, they were met by people who had already been here, but the number of people that came was overwhelming. In one year, I think it was 1847, 37,000 Irish people landed in Boston alone. They couldn't handle it. And they were just put anywhere they could be. They were put in cellars. They were put in attics, anywhere, old barns. And the conditions that these people were crammed into were horrible. They were wretched. There's stories of tenement buildings where there were hundreds of people in a tenement building. And you look at the same tenement building today might have 4 or 5 families in it. There's stories that on a block, city block, there were no toilets. You would have maybe one outhouse for about 200 to 300 people. One sink, one bathtub on that street. And that's how they survived. They came into this filth, but it was better than starving. It was better than dying. And here are some old buildings in Boston. And the neighborhoods they came into were, you might think, oh, Southie, South Boston, that's where they are. They didn't come into Southie. It was the North End. It was around Broad Street. It was Battery March. It was the waterfront. And that's where these people came. And you can imagine this alley here, teeming with people. That's what it was like with the laundry hanging over here. And this is the North End. This is prime property today. Many of the buildings you see were built later in the 1800s, but it was still Irish by that time. What they moved into was probably wooden tenements, and there are still some of those in existence. And it was teeming. The North End was an Irish ghetto. And these are the streets of the North End. And the waterfront was also teeming with Irish too. Now, what did they do for work? These people were farmers. They'd gone from a country life to the city, and they really weren't qualified to do much, but they did find work. Women had not really many choices. Most of the women ended up being scrubber women, on their knees, scrubbing the floors of the old Yankee families. That's how they made a living, or a domestic, a maid, something like that. The men had a few more options open to them. They could become waiters. That was one option. Now, the funny thing is, they couldn't even be barbers because the barber trade was cornered by the blacks at that point. They had the option of working in a grocery store. Very good jobs. Now, of course, this is if the place of employment did not have a sign on it that said no Irish need apply, they might get to work in a factory and work 14 hours a day, 7 days a week on piecework. And that means you didn't have lunch breaks or anything, because when you stopped, you lost money. And there was also people that probably just worked in their apartments. Little cottage industries were popping up all over the place. Here are some people working on garments. And these were the kind of jobs that the Irish came to have when they first got here. And they lived in tenements like this. Of course, the waterfront attracted a lot of Irishmen. They became longshoremen, stevedores, and also they were able to work along the shoreline harvesting oysters and clams and things like that. And these shorelines here were where the shipping came in, kind of abandoned today. And there's some people, I think they're clammers actually. And of course there's the ditch digger. They call them blacklegs, muckrakers, back-breaking work. Many people just died. They were worked to death. And then they put the Irish to work. The Irish, you could say in a way, the Irish built Boston. They began to excavate and they began to fill in all the marshy areas of that little island that we saw in 1630 here. And here's a picture of them removing much of what was Beacon Hill. And there's the brand new State House that was put up in the 1820s. Now, just to give you an idea of how much was filled in over these years, here is what the Puritans found. And then by 1830, the Irish were put to work filling in the shoreline. 1845. And much of the excavation at this point was the hills in Boston. They were leveled, and this dirt was used to fill in the waterfront. And then they started carting in dirt from other areas. The West Cove area, all done with Irish labor. And by 1890, we get the Back Bay. And I like to say, when I take my students on a field trip, you know why it was called the Back Bay? Because you'd be underwater if you were here 100 or so years ago. And it's funny, if you're ever near Neelan Street over here, there's a little street that says Beach Street, but it's nowhere near the water. It's Beach Street because there used to be a beach there. This was all done with Irish labor. And there was a massive backlash. This flood of Irish came in, and the natives began this backlash, and it took the form of a new political party. And this party was called the Know Nothing Party. It started off as a secret society, and if anyone asked a member what they were up to, they would say, "I know nothing." And they would never keep any records or anything, which is horrible for historians because we don't know a lot about them because everything was word of mouth. But the Know Nothing Party entered the political arena, and in Massachusetts, they overwhelmed the political system. I believe they won a majority of House seats, Senate seats, and they also elected a Know-Nothing governor. Now, the governor went right to work. They started with anti-immigrant laws, anti-Catholic laws. They even tried to make an amendment to the state constitution saying that any Irish Catholic could not serve in public office. Do you believe that could happen in America? Luckily, it did not pass. They also had a little committee that they started, which was called the Inspection of Convents Committee. And here's a little picture of the committee inspecting some nun's cell in a convent here, looking for some evidence of treachery or something like that. And I think all they found was her bedpan, or her chamber pot thunder jug, as they called it. And also we see in the media of the time great bias and bigotry here. If you look very close, and this is our friend Thomas Nast, who we know from the Tweed Ring and everything in New York City. This is a cartoon showing the evil Catholic Irish invading the pure Americans, like crocodiles coming out of with their mitre hats, their popery. The Irish were portrayed as drunks. They were portrayed as fighters. They were also, in the newspapers, they were portrayed as almost ape-like, as you see from some of these pictures here. Something to be feared. This was the hated immigrant of the time. The drunken Irish brawler. And oh, they're getting involved with the Democratic Party. They're going to take over the country. Here's a nice one. Could you ever imagine seeing anything like this in a newspaper today? The basic gist of this is, who's worse, the Irishman or the Chinaman? Well, maybe the Chinaman will eat the Irishman and then we'll be all set. Yeah, the problem is solved, yeah. Which one is worse?
What year is it?
I think this is the late 1880s, maybe 1890s. This is around that time. It's in the mid to late 1800s. And here's a nice one. Florence Nightingale and Bridget McBroser. Oh, that's scary, and that's scaring me. I gotta change that. The Irish had had enough. They started to organize. This gentleman over here, Patrick Maguire, started one of the first political clubs in Boston. And what they did was they welcomed young men to come to these clubs. They organized, and they started getting their people elected. Now, at first, it was only small positions like maybe city councilor or something like that. Actually, they didn't have that till years later, aldermen, things like this. And then, eventually, by the time of the 1880s, we got our first Irish mayor. His name was Hugh O'Brien. And this was all due to this club system, which eventually turned into what we call ward politics. Each ward in the city had their own political club, and from there they organized. And the way they did that was, if you needed anything, if you were Irish, you went to your ward boss, and that ward boss would help you find housing, help you find food, help you find a job, and it wasn't free. You had to pay them back. You know how you paid them? Your vote. That's how you paid them. This is pre-welfare. This is what they did when you needed help. You went to the ward boss. And this is how they got elected. Hugh O'Brien was the first Irish mayor to be elected. Patrick Collins later was the second Irish mayor to be elected. By this time, the Catholics, they were still a minority, and these fellows particularly felt that they had to work with the old Yankees, and they tried to work hand in hand with the Democrat Yankees, such as Charles Francis Adams, people like that. And they got elected with kind of a coalition of Irish and Yankees. Now, over in the West End, there was a gentleman, Martin Lemansney, and he was the quintessential ward boss. Like I just said, if you needed anything, he'd get it for you. And he controlled almost 100% of the vote in the West End of Boston, and he could guarantee anybody to get elected. He had massive power, and he had a few proteges. This is a young man from the North End. His name was John Fitzgerald. Here's another guy from East Boston. His name was Patrick Kennedy. And a few years later, there was a real young up-and-comer. His name was James Michael Curley. And they were all under the tutelage of Lemansney. They learned their trade with Lemansney. Now, a little bit about these fellows here. As I said, Kennedy came from the North End, and he started out as a runner for one of the ward bosses and eventually became the ward boss himself. Pat Kennedy was over in East Boston here, and he owned a bar, and that's what he operated out of. He eventually became the ward boss of East Boston. And by the time he got older, he had several bars. And Curley started out as a really poor guy over in Roxbury. And here's John Fitzgerald. Went by the name Honey Fitz. Yeah. And he lived in the North End, and believe it or not, he grew up by the water. By the time he was an adult, he was living in this tenement here. This is 4 Garden Court, and that's right off of North Square, if you're familiar with Boston. His daughter, Rose Kennedy, was born in this building. Rose Fitzgerald, I should say. And if you go there today, it's kind of sad because it's got this little marker. That's the door. Looks like it hasn't been painted since Honey Fitz lived there. And this is what he grew up in. And we think of the Kennedys and the Fitzgeralds as these mega wealthy people. He grew up, he was a poor boy. He came out of the North End, and he had gusto, he had smarts, he had the gift of gab. And he was like just this firebomb that was all over the place. And before you knew it, he was involved in city politics. Now, Patrick Kennedy, as I said, he owned a few bars, and he became very powerful himself. And the Kennedys and the Fitzgeralds, at an early age, began to merge. Here they are. They're all on a picnic here. Here's Honey Fitz, his daughter Rose, and there's the Kennedy family. I believe that was taken at Old Orchard Beach up in Maine. And here's a picture here of Kennedy in his latter years. I think you might know that guy right there. I don't know. Looks a little familiar. Yeah. Now, Mayor Collins died in his second term as mayor, and John Fitzgerald saw this as an opportunity. He was still a young guy, and nobody expected him to do this. Lemansky didn't even expect him to do it, and he ran for mayor. And I believe here's a picture of John Fitzgerald. Now, this is kind of an interesting aside here. Fitzgerald had his own political club. It was called the Jefferson Club, and it was at number 1 Charter Street in the North End. And of course, I've done all my research. I've been to all these places. I was excited to try to find the building, and I got there and I found this. Number 2 Charter Street. Guess what was nailed to that building right there? Number 1 Charter Street. The building is gone. And as I approached the building, I noticed that there was a fire station where number 1 Jefferson, or number 1 Charter Street was, where the Jefferson Club was. And I looked, I came up to it and I noticed there was a plaque. And this'll be funny in a few minutes when you get the relationship between these two. That fire station was put there by James Michael Curley. Curley and Fitzgerald were mortal enemies. And even in the 1940s, when this was built, you could see it was one final jab at Honey Fitz here. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I put that into the lecture. Probably nobody goes by that building and thinks these things. So he ran for mayor. He was elected and served in the old City Hall here, which is much more beautiful than that monstrosity that they call City Hall Plaza there, which I think should be blown up. Or, I don't know, buried or something, I don't know. And he ran on a policy of bigger, better business. And he brought business into Boston. And built up Boston, but he was still connected to that old ward politics. And when you're a ward politician, you owe people favors. So he had to give people jobs, and then the accusations of corruption and nepotism arose, and he was out. But he loved being mayor. You can tell from these pictures that he reveled in it. This was his calling. He was just this little imp that just went around and loved to talk to people. When he was in the North End, he belonged to almost every club that existed in the North End. And it was just his pleasure to be the mayor of Boston. Now, years later, this is an interesting story. Teddy Kennedy tells us this story that he remembers of his grandfather. And Honey Fitz, years later in Palm Beach, he would sit in the lobbies in the hotels in Palm Beach. And whenever anybody would come in, he would listen. If they said Boston, he'd pop out of his chair and say, "How you doing, boyo?" And everybody would know who he was, and they'd have a great conversation. He'd probably get to go out to dinner and everything. And this was Honeyfitz. This was how he was, just this bubbly old man. And here's a picture that I think personifies that a little bit. There he is in his older days. He's buried over in Rosendale. And these are all the positions that he held. Not just mayor, but he was also city councilor, a number of other things. And there's his grave. And, of course, there was a highway named after. I remember the Fitzgerald Highway very fondly. Sitting in traffic. Yeah. It was nice to look at the buildings, though, at least. And as we know, this is what it looked like at one point. And now, if you go there today, of course, we have the Rose Kennedy Greenway, which is directly above the world's most expensive car wash, called the Big Dig. Yes. And then we have the age of Curly, James Michael Curly. And here he is during his latter years, probably running for his last election here. Just the mention of his name. Sometimes I'll do lectures, I just mention his name and I hear, "Oh, Curly." He started off as a poor boy in the south end of Boston. This is a picture of him as a young man. He lived on Northampton Street, and that's right near Boston University, what is now Boston City Hospital, University Hospital. And if you go down there today, number 28, the tenement that he lived in is gone. But if you look around, the building right next door to where he would have lived is this. So you can imagine, this is probably what he grew up in. Early on, his father was a laborer, and his father worked on road crews, and he, from all accounts, he was lifting a large block of stone and had an aneurysm or something and died on the spot. Now, James Michael Curley's mother had to raise him along with his brother, and she was one of those scrubber women that was down on her knees scrubbing the floors for the Yankee families. He was a smart boy. He read a lot. Didn't have any more than a high school education, but he could quote Shakespeare verbatim. And he had this loud, booming, sonorous voice, so he could hypnotize crowds when he talked to the crowds as well. And here he had his own political club. This was called, of all things, the Tammany Club. Gives you a little bit of idea where he's coming from if you're familiar with Boss Tweed. Here's the location today. I don't believe it's the same building, but it kind of has the same shape almost. That's the corner where his Tammany Club was on in Hampton Street. Now, Curly rose through the ranks. First he became an alderman, then a city councilor. Then he ran into a little bit of trouble. One of his constituents, of course, James Michael Curley was one of the best ward bosses. If you needed anything from Curley, he'd get it for you. One of his constituents had flunked the exam for the Postal Service because he couldn't spell Constantinople. And he came to James Michael Curley and he said, "Oh, James Michael, I can't pass the damn exam. What am I to do?" And Curley said, "I know what I'll do. I'll take it for you." So the next time the exams came up, he went in, passing himself off as this constituent, took the exam and passed it with flying colors. And then he got caught and went to jail. And you would think that would be the end of James Michael Curley as a politician. But better than any politician today, they actually say he's the first modern politician. He put a spin on it. He said, "I did it for a friend." And to the Irish, the poor Irish in these neighborhoods who knew they needed somebody to help them give a hand up, they saw that as somebody that was fighting for them, and the next time he ran for office, he got elected. And then we come to the election of 1913, and our old friend Honey Fitz is running against James Michael Curley. Now, this election shows you a little bit of the character of Curley. In this election, Honey Fitz was in the lead in the polls. Now, Curley had to find out some way to beat this guy, and Curley had his old bag of tricks. He was known for dirty tricks, long before Tricky Dicky Nixon. Curley had an operative who had followed Honey Fitz around and found that at the end of every night, after all of his politicking, he would go to this certain roadhouse. And that he would, although he was a teetotaler, he would have a few dances with a cigarette girl named Toodles. Now, this got back to Curley. This is what Curley did. He sent an unsigned letter to Honey Fitz's wife, explaining the situation and saying, if you do not want this to become public, I would advise your husband to drop out of the race. Now, of course, imagine this scene. You're John Fitzgerald, Honey Fitzgerald. You've probably just been out for a dance with Toodles, and as far as I can tell, it was nothing more than just a dance, maybe a peck on the cheek or something, but this was blown up to something else. Honey Fitz came home to his wife standing there on the stairway with a little letter in her hand. Who is Toodles? And he was able, of course, had the gift of gab and was able to convince her that this was nothing more than just political chicanery and stayed in the race. James Michael Curley took another step. He put an ad in the paper, and he put an ad saying he was going to do 2 lectures. One lecture, I believe, was entitled Great Lovers from Cleopatra to Present. The other one was, it was Great Lovers, Cleopatra to Toodles. Nobody knew who Toodles was except for one person. The other one was Great Libertines from Henry VIII till present. When Fitzgerald saw that, that was a shot across the bow. When Fitzgerald saw that, he all of a sudden dropped out of the race because he had poor health and wanted to spend time with his family. James Michael Curley won the election that year. And here's a great picture. This gives you an idea of the type of guy he was. Now, I could go on forever about Curley. When I was designing this lecture, I thought I could do a whole lecture on Curley. So I decided to give you what I call the good, the bad, and the Curley. There was the good Curley. Then there was the bad Curley. The good Curley was somebody that made sure people had housing, had food, had jobs. For instance, a great example is when he first became mayor. And today, in this world, it doesn't seem like a whole lot. The scrubber women, like his mother, who were down on their knees scrubbing the floors, he put an executive order in to get them mops. He said, no woman should have to be on her knees unless she is praying to God. And to these women, just a mop made a big difference. Another thing is, you know how politicians are always glad-handing for the camera and doing all these things? This is the Curley that only his driver knew about. It comes down to us because his driver related it years later. And Curley, it seems, would come out of his office at the city hall here. Here's some pictures of Curley. And the driver related a story that, and oftentimes, Curley knew that there was an old gentleman who pretty much lived on the street. He was an alcoholic. And late at night when Curley would get out around 10 o'clock, nobody would be around. There were no, reporters or anything. He would oftentimes walk over with a $20 bill and shake the man's hand and say, here, Mike, here's the money I owed you. Nobody knew about this. This was the good Curley. He was the one that helped people. He wanted to help the poor. He got people jobs, housing. And then there's the bad Curley. And let me see if I can get to that picture. Let me show you something. This personifies the bad Curley. This is his little cottage on the Jamaica Way. And I believe at the time he was making maybe $10,000 a year, which was pretty good for somebody. And this house was a mansion. And people would say, how do you pay for this on your mayor's salary? And he would say, oh, I've got a interest. He actually said he was in a partnership with a plumber whose name of all people was Daly. And that's how he made his money. That's not how he made his money. He made his money through graft. He made his money through corruption. Here's a good example of how he made his money. There was a roofer who came to him for a job. This was common. And the roofer said, I need a job. And Curly said, okay, we've got a job for you. There's a school over in the south end that needs to be, has the roof repaired. This is what you're going to do, buddy-o. You're going to put in a bid for $25,000, but the thing costs $20,000. And guess who gets the $5,000? Curly got it. Then it gets better. The roofer went over to the school, got up on his ladder, went on the roof, and found that it didn't need to be repaired. So he returned to Curly and explained the situation, and Curly said, well, just go up there and make a few banging noises like you're doing something, and then come down and get the money. This was classic James Michael Curly. He was also a bit of a thug, too. There's a story that during a campaign, James Michael Curly came into the radio station where an adversary was actually in one of the booths, and he was talking badly about Curly. On air, James Michael Curly walked in and pummeled this man in the radio booth. Can you imagine that happening today? Could you imagine Mitt Romney walking in and hitting the president or something? Or Mayor Menino doing something like that? There's also a story of a newspaper man who wrote some unsavory things about Curly, and then Curly ran into him on the street. Literally ran into him. He decked him right on Washington Street. I've read the account of the gentleman who said, the next thing I knew, I was looking up at Curly as a slew of swears were coming my way as I was on my back on the ground. And could you imagine this happening today? The lawsuits, nothing ever happened. Curly also ran into trouble. He, by the way, served 4 terms as mayor, 1 term as governor. While he was serving one of his terms as mayor, had actually got elected, he was convicted of a federal offense, which is a long story. He had gotten involved with a silver mine, and the men who were running the silver mine were peddling political influence. Make a long story short, he ended up in federal prison. He's the mayor of Boston in federal prison. And then when he got out, it was like nothing ever happened. Actually, a petition went around to have him gain early release. And every politician in Massachusetts, except for one, signed that politician. That politician who didn't sign that petition was a gentleman by the name of John F. Kennedy. And you know why he didn't do that, right? The old toodles. So Curly was a political fixture in Boston up until, the 40s and the 50s. Now, by the time the World War II runs around, he's run for mayor several times. He served as congressman. He was a governor. A whole resume of things that he's done. And he actually ran for a 5th term as governor. This is him posing 5th term. He didn't get it. Number 5. Now, by the end of his career, he became somewhat almost a fixture in the State House. By this time, he couldn't get elected anymore, and he was just trying to scrounge around for money because all the money he had gotten through graft and corruption, he had lost in different deals and whatnot. And this is a story that we get from Tip O'Neill. Tip O'Neill said that Curly approached him once and asked him if he could work on his campaign, do some fundraising. And Tip knew that he needed the money. He'd just been kind of standing around. People were starting to feel sorry. Here's this famous old politician. So he said, okay, go ahead. You can go out and raise some money for me. Now, the funny thing is, some of the donors started coming in and saying, I gave you $20,000, not $15,000. up to his old tricks. And then, a few years before he died, a book came out called The Last Hurrah. And the main character in it, Mayor Skeffington, was based on Curly. And the author of it, O'Connor, thought that it was not a very good representation of Curly, and actually avoided coming in contact with Curly because he thought he might get the treatment like the reporter or the man in the radio studio. But Curly loved it. He loved that he was getting this notoriety, that he was now famous again because of this book. What's more, this book was made into a movie, and the person that played the mayor was Spencer Tracy, another Irishman, and Curly reveled in it. Sometimes he would say, he ran into O'Connor, and O'Connor was ready for a confrontation, and Curly said, "You know, the part I like about the book is the part when I die." Because he knew it was based on him, and sometimes he would refer to himself as Skeffington almost. And just a few years after that, Curly passed on. And these are some of the positions that he held. See the word unsuccessful over and over again? He was a professional politician. They say he was the last of the ward bosses, but in reality, I think he was the first of the modern politicians. Bill Clinton could probably take a few lessons from this guy. This is his grave site here. It's Mount Carmel Cemetery in Rosendale, and as you see, he's got his resume on the gravestone. But I think, you know, the thing that the title that he treasured the most is on that gravestone. And that is the mayor to the poor. And then, I think it was 1952, he passed away. And as you see here, he was able to lay in state in the State House. I don't think this has been given to anyone since. Kevin White just recently passed away, and even he was not allowed to do this. And of course, we've got a statue in Boston, old Mayor Curly. I take my students here every year, and they have no idea who he is. They just think they like to sit next to him on his lap and everything. But in closing, I'd like to say that these people, the Irish, came to our shores as servants, as prisoners, as half-dead, starving refugees. They endured ethnic and religious persecution and bigotry. They endured squalid, wretched poverty. They endured back-breaking, menial work. But in the end, they overcame, they surmounted, and they prevailed. Thank you for coming tonight.